So, on Wednesday, I want to thank Matt for filling in for me. I definitely wasn't feeling well and feeling mostly better now. Uh, you left off at the beginning of Job chapter 16, so that's where we're going to pick up this morning. Job chapter 16, starting in verse 1. In Job chapter 16, starting in verse 1, we'll read down to verse 5. It says, "Then Job responded, I have heard many things like these. Miserable comforters are you all. Is there no end to windy words? Or what provokes you that you answer? I too could speak like you, if only I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. Or I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the condolence of my lips could lessen your pain." So in response to his friends and their pointed messages that he should repent, what does Job say to them? What's his response here in these first 5 verses? Matt.
You guys are awful. You aren't helping at all.
Miserable comforters, right?
Well, then last week when I was sick, if somebody called me and tell me, you need to get back in church, you need to do this and that,
Yeah.
I'd be very upset with them. So I can understand what Job is going through and the anger that has to make them feel sometimes that they just don't get it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really great example because that happens sometimes, right? You might have an illness or some other thing going on in your life that's kept you from going to church, for example, and someone could call you up and they could just say, you need to get back here, without saying, hey, I noticed you've been gone. Why is that? And so instead of seeking to understand, they could just start telling you what they think you need to do, right? And so Job is saying, you're all a bunch of miserable comforters, right? And I like that they use, not just Job, but his friends, they kind of use this same kind of phrase back and forth. They talk about being windy, right? Is there no end to windy words? Or they say that you're full of the east wind or whatever. Everyone just keeps saying that, each other's a blowhard,
Well, in this day and age, it's a windbag.
Yeah. And they keep saying that back and forth to each other. Job basically says, if our roles were reversed, I could do the same thing that you're doing. I could shake my head at you and say how you need to fix things. But then Job says, or I could be helping you. I could be strengthening you. I could be condoling you, and I could be lessening your pain with my words. And so Job is essentially saying that that's what I'm looking for. That would be helpful to me, is right now, in my pain while I'm suffering, you could be saying things that would be helping me and comforting me. And instead, you're not, right? So yeah, exactly. Job is basically saying that, his friends are poor comforters here. And so if we keep going, in verse 6, let's read from verse 6 to verse 14. Verse 6 to verse 14, it says, "If I speak, my pain is not lessened. And if I refrain, what pain leaves me? But now he has exhausted me. You have laid waste all my group of loved ones. You have shriveled me up. It has become a witness. And my infirmity rises up against me. It testifies to my face. His anger has torn me and hunted me down. He has gnashed at me with his teeth. My enemy glares at me. They have gaped at me with their mouths. They have slapped me on the cheek with contempt. They have massed themselves against me. God hands me over to criminals and tosses me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he shattered me. And he has grasped me by my neck and shaken me to pieces. He has also set me up as his target. His arrows surround me. He splits open my kidneys without mercy. He pours out my bile on the ground. He breaks through me with breach after breach. He He runs at me like a warrior. And so Job here is again following in the pattern of Hebrew poetry by kind of reiterating with multiple examples his main point here. But in these verses, what's he going after? So after calling his friends bad comforters and saying, I wish you would have comforted me in my pain, he's kind of talking about his pain. But what is he saying specifically in verses 16 to 14? Or 6 to 14?
Well, he pretty much saying God has turned against him. God has given him up. And, you know, he's not happy because he doesn't understand how God's allowing such things to happen to him.
Yeah, I mean, he says that he's basically saying that God is his enemy right now.
Yeah.
And you get the feeling from the context here that he's not saying that God is a bad guy, but that God is against him, rather, is more of the tone here. And, you know, obviously that's not where Job wants to be, but look at some of the ways that he describes God here. He describes him as an archer in one case. He describes him kind of as a beast, you know, sinking his teeth into him. He describes him maybe as a fighter, the way that he's grasping the neck and shaking him to pieces. He describes him as a warrior running at him. So he describes God as all these dangerous, powerful foes that are attacking him. But at the very beginning of that section, notice in verse 6 that while Job is talking about how he feels like God is against him, he's also saying that he feels stuck here. He feels trapped because if he speaks up about his pain, it doesn't help, right? But if he does speak up about if he doesn't speak up about his pain, then nothing happens, right? So if I speak up, it doesn't help, and if I be quiet, that doesn't help either, right? And so Job's basically kind of saying, like, you know, this is the verse that's tying these two things together for his friends. He's saying, you guys are bad comforters. I'm in pain. You should be comforting me. And it doesn't seem to matter if I speak up or if I don't, because if I hold it all in, it doesn't go away. And I want to speak up, but then you guys attack me. And then he starts to talk about the pain that he's feeling. So apparently Job settled on speaking about it rather than holding it in here. And remember, he had already been holding it in for a week. And so he's speaking out about it here, and this is where he's starting to talk about how he feels that God is against him. Any thoughts or comments in this section? Matt?
I thought it was kind of interesting in verse 9. He says, my adversary glares at me, or my opponent, depending on the translation you look at. I was kind of thinking, of course, you know, Satan is the one who's been given license to do these things.
Right.
And that's not the word for Satan, but it's kind of a synonym. And
Yeah.
even though he's confused about this, there's a lot of times the things said in this are foreshadowing other things, or sort of saying it without knowing what they're saying.
Yeah.
Kind of ideas.
Yeah. What I also like, as you read through, how Job has this spiritual conflict going on. You know, he keeps making these hopeful statements that are kind of scattered and sprinkled throughout there about how he hopes, you know, in God, and he looks towards heaven, and, you know, he's hopeful, but then he goes and talks about how he feels like God is against him, you know, and so there's this conflict within Job that he is trying to resolve, and he has been unable to, which is part of the point of this book, is it's going to help us to get through that. I also thought in verse 11, when he says that God hands him over to criminals, to the hands of the wicked, I don't know if he's just kind of talking in general, that's how he feels, or if he's referring to the fact that the Chaldeans and the Sabaeans were the ones who attacked his servants and his livestock and everything earlier. He might be meaning that quite literally there. So I wasn't sure, but I thought that was worth calling out. I also thought that if you look at verse 13, this one, depending on how your verse reads, it's kind of gross, but it talks about this injury to the liver and the kidneys, right? Bile comes out of your liver. And it's pretty graphic verse, but if you think about what that is, that's a mortal wound, right? That's the kind of wound that you would die from, especially in that day and age, right? That is a mortal wound. And so what Job is essentially saying here is that he's been hurt to the point of dying, right? He's mortally wounded. He is going to die from these pains. And that's very expressive of how he feels. And it goes along with all the other verses that we've studied so far where Job longs for the grave, and he talks about how that would be a release, and he's going to fade away in a few days, you know. He's made very similar statements. So this is just kind of echoing that again, that Job feels like the pain that he's endured, it's going to be the end of him. It's going to happen because he's just not going to be able to keep going under that. Did anybody else feel differently or catch anything else notable in those verses they wanted to share? Okay. So now, let's read the next two verses, 15 to 17. Job says, I have sewed sackcloth over my skin and thrust my horn in the dust. My face is flushed from weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids, although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. So I think that this again shows Job being confused. Here in verse 15 and 16, Job is showing he's got this humble attitude. He's showing humility, right? And he kind of states some of those common symbols of that, right? Being covered in sackcloth, being covered in dust. You know, he's humbled himself. He's weeping. You know, it's sorrow. He's not being arrogant here. He's not violent, and he says that his prayer is pure. So Job is still maintaining that he's innocent. He's humbled himself, and so he's really seeking. He's seeking answers here, right? He's humbled himself and he's seeking these answers. And then he moves on in verse 18. He says, "Earth, do not cover my blood, and may there be no resting place for my cry. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my advocate is on high." So Job doesn't want his suffering to just be covered up and forgotten. He wants some sort of resolution, some sort of answer. And again, in verse 19, he's talking about having this advocate on high. You know, he's talking about heaven being his witness. So he knows that he's righteous and pure, and even though he just said that he feels like God is against him, we also see, again, he still has hopefulness in heaven, because, right, who else would he trust in other than God? Even though God seems to be against him, he's also confident that God knows of his innocence as well. He's just confused about, he can't match up these two things in his head. And I thought it was worth calling out in verse 19 that he uses this language again about an advocate. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Turn over with me, if you would, to 1 John chapter 2. 1 John chapter 2, in verse 1, John says, "My little children, I am writing these things to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous." So Job is making that wish known for an advocate. And that's something that we have. We have that advocate in Jesus. So just kind of like what Matt said about how a lot of the writings here kind of foreshadow what's coming. You know, Job certainly didn't know the full glory of Jesus, but the words that he's saying are pointing forward into the future towards Jesus. There are other verses that can tie into that. There's a couple in Titus as well. But that's just the first one that came to mind for me. And so Job is wishing for that advocate, that witness from heaven. Any other thoughts, comments, questions there? Okay. So let's finish out the chapter here. So then Job says, my friends are scoffers. So we're kind of going back to the statements he made at the beginning about how they're miserable comforters. So after saying, you're bad comforters, I'm enduring a lot of pain, here's what my pain feels like, he circles back and says, my friends are scoffers. My eye weeps to God that one might plead for a man with God, as a son of man with his neighbor. For when a few years are past, I shall go the way of no return. And so again, reinforcing that he wishes that he had someone to intercede with him, who would plead for him, because Job feels like after a few years, I'm going to fade away from this. I'm not going to recover from the things that I've endured. And that is the end of chapter 16. Matt?
So jumping back a little bit to verse
Yeah.
15, I thought it was interesting. He says, I've sewed sackcloth over my skin. Of course, sackcloth was what people would put on when they're mourning and
Mm-hmm.
suffering. But he sewed it on, almost maybe the permanence of it. It's like, I'm not
Yeah.
just putting this on. I've got this on, and I'm just going to have this on. It's part of my clothing.
Yeah.
It's just part of me. And that, back to what we just read here, it's just a few more years, he's just going to be mourning, he's going to die. Kind of
Yeah.
what that look is.
No, that's a good point. I didn't catch that. But yeah, that does speak of permanence, doesn't it? Like, I put this on and it's not coming off now. That's a good point. Anybody else?
Whenever he says that like that, if you think about it, it's as if though he's giving up and he's expecting to be like this for all the time he has on earth.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if God has set his gaze against him, then he's like, I'm not going to hold out, certainly, if this keeps up. So, God would be my hope, and if my hope is turned against me, then, if something else doesn't change, then this is what's going to be. Yeah. Good points. So jumping over to chapter 17, we can dive into this a little bit here. After telling his friends how they're miserable comforters and kind of talking about the pain he's suffering and why, Job is once again kind of going into this theme of being hopeless and feeling broken. So it's very similar to chapter 16, but it's a little bit different. In chapter 16, he was talking about how he felt mortally wounded and how God was against him. Here, he's kind of talking about the results of that, which is a feeling of helplessness and being broken. And so that's kind of what he talks about. And so let's see. Let's start by reading. We'll read down to verse 6 to begin with. So Job chapter 17, starting in verse 1, says, my spirit is broken. My days are extinguished. The grave is ready for me. Mockers are certainly with me, and my eye gazes on their provocation. Make a pledge for me yourself. Who is there that will be my guarantor? For you have kept their hearts away from understanding, therefore you will not exalt them. He who informs against friends for a share of the spoils, the eyes of his children will also perish. But he has made me a proverb among the people, and I am one at whom people spit. So the first verse is pretty obvious, right? Broken spirit, not many days left, the grave's ready for me. That's pretty hopeless and depressing, and that's kind of the tone that Job sets for the overall chapter. And then you can almost imagine that he's like staring directly at his friends for this next part where he says, mockers are certainly with me. That's very pointed, that's very directed. He's talking about his friends. But someone explain verse 3 for me. What's he talking about making a pledge for him or shaking hands for him, depending on what your version says? Matt?
I think maybe he's looking for who's going to be that witness or who's going to stand up for him, because he is in fact innocent, but who's going to show that that's true?
Right.
Guarantor.
Yeah, and he's speaking towards God in this part. He's directing it towards God, and he's, who's going to do that? And he asks God to do that for him. He says, make me a pledge with yourself. Please do this for me, because if it's not going to be you, then no one else is going to be able to do it. Another way that you could word that is basically that this whole thing, this Job's entire life it's this broken mess, and nobody can fix that. Job's friends are actually saying that that's on Job to fix, right? They've been saying, Job, you need to repent and that'll fix this. But Job's saying, there's no one that can fix this, not me, not any man. Only God can make this right. And so he's asking God to step in and fix this thing that God has destroyed, because no one else can do it. Now, what about verse 4? He says that God has kept his friends' hearts from understanding, and therefore he won't exalt them. What is he meaning here? Why would God keep his friends from understanding?
Well, the whole construction of this situation with Satan in the beginning and all that is mysterious to all of the players here,
right,
except for us as readers. And so it would be natural for them to misunderstand, and so I guess maybe that's what's being said here.
Yeah, I mean it might be. It's kind of a confusing verse. It's basically Job saying, God could enlighten his friends if he wanted to. God could lift this mystery from everybody if he wanted to, but he hasn't, right? And he also seems to indicate the fact that since God hasn't enlightened his friends, that this might be showing his displeasure against them even. That kind of seems to be indicated there. The fact that his friends maybe didn't have a better attitude towards Job, that God didn't see fit to enlighten them further maybe. So that's one possible interpretation there. I thought it was a confusing verse.
Well, jumping forward to the end of the book, spoiler alert, that God does come and speak to these things, and he doesn't exalt the friends.
Right, he does not.
The opposite is the case, where they have to have Job pray for them and all this. So
yeah.
So they're so that's the sort of foreshadowing too.
Yeah, it is. And then in verse 6, depending on what your translation says, it might say that he's been made a byword among the people, or an object of scorn, or a proverb among the people, right? Job says that. Now, it's pretty easy to see what an object of scorn is, right? My translation says, he has made me a proverb among the people, which I thought was an interesting way to put it. But when you think about that, a proverb is just a well-known saying, right, that contains a little bit of wisdom maybe, or something like that. And if Job has been made a proverb among the people, then he's kind of been made an example of, right? Imagine if you called someone a Judas Iscariot, right? It's the same kind of idea. People would know right away what you meant, right? Because you used this infamous name. You're essentially calling them a traitor of the worst kind, right? Because that's what their name carries. That's what their story is. And so he's saying, you've made me a proverb. If someone calls their buddy a Job, oh, well, that guy must have done something terrible and his life's a wreck now. It's the same idea here. And so he's just saying that, I've become this object of derision to the point that people just have to say my name and everyone knows what all that entails. So continuing on, he says, my eye has also become inexpressive because of grief, and all my body parts are like a shadow. The upright will be appalled at this, and the innocent will stir himself up against the godliness. Nevertheless, the righteous will hold to his way, and the one who has clean hands will grow stronger and stronger. But come again, all of you now, for I do not find a wise man among you. My days are past, my plans are torn apart. The wishes of my heart, they make night into day, saying, the light is near in the presence of darkness. If I hope for Sheol as my home, I make my bed in the darkness. If I call to the grave, you are my father, and to the maggot, you are my mother and my sister. Where then is my hope? And who looks at my hope? Will it go down with me into Sheol? Shall we go down together into the dust? All right. So a shorter chapter, but somebody take a stab at summing up what Job is saying for the rest of this here. What's he getting at?
Despair.
It's a despair.
Life is
Yeah. Life is over. How about verse 14? He's talking about calling the grave his father, the maggot his mother and sister. That's kind of gross too, but
That's his future. His future is to be friends with
yeah.
the gross death thing.
Well, he's using family terms for death, right? Death is his comfort now. You know, people would go to their family for comfort, and he's essentially saying, like, I'm going to be close with them. They're going to be my only comforters in this time. I'm looking forward to death. That's all I've got left, right? And he even says in verse 15, where's my hope? It's, should we go down together into the grave? You know, essentially that's all I've got left. That's where I'm going, right? Back up a little bit further here. Let's see. What about verses 8 to 9? He's talking about the innocent stirring himself up against the godless, the righteous holding to his way, the one who has clean hands grows stronger and stronger. What does any of that have to do with Job's hopelessness?
Maybe that they'll see the injustice of it, because he is in fact righteous. He shouldn't be punished. So they'll be appalled. I mean, that maybe explains part of it. The upright will be appalled at his being mistreated.
Yeah. I think, again, that's one of those little moments of Job having the right hopefulness, but it's like sprinkled through here. You know, because he follows it up by saying he doesn't find a wise man among any of his friends, right? I think he's saying that a wise man would see, a righteous man would see that this is the way to recover, that they would see this from his example, but that there are no wise men among his friends, so no one's gonna learn the right thing from what Job is going through. That's the best, I would guess, for that part. But we're right at time. Are there any other final questions or comments before we leave off there? Okay, we will pick up in Job chapter 18 on Wednesday. All right, thank you, everyone.